He's just released his latest book, which is Living Among Tigers. And uh, it's an eye opener because it tells the story of his struggles to study the tiger, to live in the forest, to live in the national park, and to deal with all the forces which are there to oppose conservation of the tiger and wildlife. And now I come from the forest bureaucracy, which Ullas likes to, he has had a lot of problems with the bureaucracy. So in spite of that, we started life in the forest discipline almost at the same time. He's a bit older than me, except that I chose to go into the bureaucracy. And he, being an engineer, somehow decided that he has to shift over into wildlife. He has written about it in his books, but I'd like you to say a few words about it, Ullas. Now, when I read your book, I find that it's not just numbers that you're crunching. It's not just as a scientist that you're approaching it. You seem to have a deep identification with the animals that you are studying as individuals. Now, how does that work when you identify with an individual, give it a name? Do you get very deeply involved in it?
No, I think interest in wildlife, uh, birds, animals in particular, is very, very deeply embedded in human psyche. I think most children get fascinated. That's why we take children to the zoo. But what happens is the formal schooling system kills that interest. It turns them into boring guys who want to compete in exams and do things. So I was lucky that my father, Ullas Karanth, who was an experimentalist in every cell in his body, didn't believe in schooling. So we were homeschooled till the age of 11, minimal teaching in any sense. So, but the house was full of National Geographic from 1938, all sorts of wildlife books. My father had an interest in nature. I had an aunt in Mangalore who gave me Salim Ali's book in 1955. I was just 8 years old, encouraged me to watch birds, which I started. So this hardwired love for nature never left me, which it does if you go to formal schooling. So that really was the trigger. And the next turn came when I had to have a job, so I went to NITK Surathkal, as it is called now. I hated every minute of it. I bunked classes and started going to forest on my Java motorcycle. And at that time, 17 or 18, there were 2 or 3 people in the Forest Service who influenced me greatly. One was Mr. Shamsundar, who was my cousin. He took me to the forest and he kind of opened my eyes to the real issues of forest conservation. Other one was K.M. Chinnappa in Nagarhole, who was a ranger who taught me fieldcraft. So when I came back to college, I read an article in Life magazine by George Schaller called My Year with Tigers. It just blew me away and I said, this is what I want to do. Really study wildlife using modern quantitative methods, which didn't exist. Even Salim Ali was not a quantitative biologist. So Schaller became my role model, and it took me 10 years of steering my life, doing other things, farming, etc., to finally get trained in wildlife biology in University of Florida. I hooked up with Mel Sundquist, and then I got hired by Schaller to work for WCS. That's how the trigger came.
So if some youngster today wants to follow in your footsteps, what are the avenues open to him, and what would you advise such people who are not so committed to their own majors or disciplines and want to shift?
I think this interest is there and it's growing. There are many young people. But the problem that I faced still in some sense remains to a lesser degree, that of a career. What do you do? How do you make a career? So there are 2 ways to kind of make this your career, perhaps 3. But the major one avenue actually is the forest department and the forest service. But unfortunately, that avenue has no way to pick people who are passionate about animals or wildlife. It's a civil service like recruitment, whether it's as a ranger, forester or IFS, it's going to coaching factories, getting into the system. So really interested people don't do that. Even my own master students, I try to persuade them, they don't like to get in there because it's not a pool of passionate people. I think if the system for recruitment is changed and it is turned into a professional service, like if to become a doctor you have to do 5 years of medicine, or an engineer, it should be turned in US, in most parts of the world, wildlife biologists are trained professionally for 4 or 5 years and then hired into the wildlife service. Some radical change is required, and I hope some visionary DGF like you comes again and makes that change.
Ullas, I would like your take on the role of science in wildlife management in the field. Now, you are a person who's seen both sides of the picture, because you went in trying to study the tiger, but very soon you got involved in the actual management of the reserve, managing people, managing media, and so on. And you yourself faced the problem of dealing with poachers and so on. So you're a person who knows both sides of the picture. So what is exactly wildlife science, and how would you relate it to the strategy and the practice of wildlife management?
Yeah, that's a very, very important and interesting question. There are two sides to it. I would say, let us compare it to medicine. At the core of it, there are trained doctors who will do the job in some sense. But around them and beyond them is a huge system of hospital superintendents, nurses, the machine guys who work the machines, the power. So the scientist can't do all that. He's not designed to do that. That is sort of the hospital administration side. I think a lot of what the administrators should legitimately doing is this. But the core of it, like how do you cure a patient? Here our patient is a species that's going down the tube, let us say. That has to come from science. So that's the role of the scientist. Then the other thing is there's a lot of misconception in the public here in general as to what is wildlife science. See, a wildlife conservationist can be driven purely by passion, just saying that I love tigers or some other species. It can be a purely emotional thing, and in fact that emotional support for conservation is critical to generate sufficient social momentum for any conservation. But the professional conservationist job is slightly different. Trained wildlife, for example, in the US lexicon, wildlife lexicon, it's defined as terrestrial free-ranging vertebrates. That is, animal with vertebra that are not marine, that are terrestrial, and they are free. They are not in fenced areas or... So under this definition, a wildlife biologist or a wildlife scientist has three roles which we don't always recognize. The one that we readily recognize is recovering endangered species, protecting things from going down. But a legitimate role for the profession, not necessarily in India but worldwide, also involves harvesting wild species for human use. I mean, without thinking, we see that happening in fisheries. Fish are harvested, inland, oceanic. The same holds for wildlife in certain circumstances where it is okay to do it, where it's sustainable or where it's practical. The third one is wildlife biology or wildlife conservation cannot ignore people. So there are some species or some instances or specifics where you have to destroy something that is causing more problems to human society. So the conservation as a whole field will be set back because social support will collapse for conservation. So all three roles are there. Now lastly, what do we do? What do wildlife biologists do? This is again just the science side of things. There is fields, there's a multiplicity of fields. There is ecology, which is just studying animals. There is animal behavior studies. There is wildlife statistical ecology, which deals with numbers. There's a whole gamut of fields are merged in the field of wildlife biology, just like an engineer brings in metallurgy, he brings in chemistry, he brings in physics to solve a problem, like that a wildlife conservation scientist pulls in from all these fields and tries to solve a specific problem. That's the idea.
When you started your work, for some reason you chose radio telemetry, after radio collaring the tiger, tranquilizing it, fitting a collar on it. Now, I am really grateful that in this book, you have exhaustively dealt with your whole experience there, because there was a lot of misconceptions or stories in the press and so on. Even we as forest officers who are not in the thick of it did not really know. So now you have set the record straight. This information you got from specifically radio telemetry, radio tracking of the animals. You radio collared a few individuals. Now, can you tell us how this information helped you to develop a picture of tiger biology, its population dynamics and so on? How has this helped to feed in to the strategy which the conservationists are using now?
One of the things is there are two aspects to looking at wildlife. One is looking at the level of animal behavior or individual animal behavior or a group of animals and how they behave. One is population level. How is this population doing? Are we losing 10%? Are we gaining 10%? These are two different kinds of questions. So when I began my research, I started with the population level study for my master's because there was zero information on how much prey is there, because the prey really drives the whole system. Prey is everything. So without that, the predators. So my first work under my master's was actually a population level study of how much prey of different species is there. It meant developing new methods, employing those methods, line transect for the first time in India in 1986. But once I got that itself opened my eyes. The idea was that African savannas have a lot of wildlife, large hoofed animals, and the Asian tropical forests are poor. This was the limit of our knowledge. But once I made the measurements, we realized that the prey species are as abundant. Once they are protected from hunters and after the recovery, they are as abundant as they are in Africa. This was an eye-opener, which immediately triggered a question in my mind. Then we need to go and look at how big are tiger territories, because that's a reflection of all this. So the telemetry actually was a slightly next step of my study. Now, if you are watching monkeys, the thing with behavior studies is you have to recognize individual animals and study them. So in the case of bird, they put bird rings. In the case of monkeys, you can habituate them and look at closely, or you can catch them and mark them in some way, raccoons, whatever. You trap them and mark them in some way. So the old method of studying lions and hyenas and all that George Schaller used in the 60s in Africa was actually catching lions and putting tags on them, tranquilizing them. But luckily in 1960s, Cochrane invented radiotelemetry, the whole idea of putting a small collar on the animal. So not only you catch it and then you get data when you see it again, you actually get continuous data. And Mel Sundquist, who was my professor in Florida, was the first person to radio track tigers. That's how I got into that. And what that gave, the critical piece of information about tigers is the size of a female's home range. I started measuring home ranges of females in Nagarhole. The home range of a female was 20 square kilometers. Meanwhile, my colleague in Russia, Dale Mikkel, had started collaring a couple of years later. Female home range was 600 square kilometers. Here it's 20, there it's 30 times more. The animal is the same, its predation rate is the same, the body size is the same. So the key was the prey. How the prey defines home range size, how then you can track. And this was a fantastic information because you have, Nagarhole is 600 square kilometers. A single female can survive in Nagarhole if that place was in Russia. But we could have 20 or 30 females in Nagarhole. So it gave an upbeat, it's a way how you manage a landscape. Where do you want your tigers? So that's how that fed in.
So, in your assessment, some of the failures in, let us say, Sariska or Pench, was it because of attrition of prey species, or would poaching and stuff like that also have contributed?
If you look at the tiger as it's a species-wide range, its original distribution was from Armenia to Bali, from Iraq to Vladivostok. It covered 30 present-day countries. That was the distribution about 200 years ago. Today, you look at the range, it is about 1,60,000 square kilometers, which is 7% of the original range. The species has lost 93% of its distribution in last 200 years. And all the summary of the research kinds of suggests that the primary driver of this decline, one was clearance of habitat for agriculture, because you take the habitat away. But still we have a lot of habitat. But once you still have habitat, it's not taken away to agriculture. Hunting of prey species has been the biggest driver, because protein deficiency, without domestic animal proteins, people hunted the tiger's prey. And killing a tiger requires 500 prey to support a single tiger. And the moment you eliminate that prey base, they can't breed, they can't reproduce, and the population collapses. This was the second biggest thing. The third factor was actually direct hunting of tigers. We had a period, particularly from there's some estimate that if you go back and do some reverse calculations from genetics, there could have been 3 to 4 lakh tigers in India at one point in time, about 500 years ago, before guns, steel, gunpowder, all these came. But the 17th, 19th centuries were the real stage when tiger hunting was massive. Mahesh is somewhere here. He has documented it very meticulously. For bounties, between 1875 and 1925, 75 to 80,000 tigers were killed. But that's not all. Not all is accounted. I would say the real number would be double that perhaps. So this was killed for trophy hunting, and we always talk about these Maharajas who shot hundreds of tigers and all that. Even the Maharaja of Mysore was the first chairman of the Wildlife Board of India, shot several dozen tigers in the 60s, 50s. So, but the ordinary people also killed a lot of tigers. There was a bounty of 100 rupees on a tiger. If you killed a tiger, produced the tail before the deputy commissioner, you got 100 rupees. I know a Cordova villager who shot 27 tigers bound. So there was a combination of all this that pushed the tiger to the brink.
So the $1 million question is, what do you think the status of the tiger is today? Is it safe? Is it recovering? Or is it on the brink?
But I think I need to step back a little, because I am 74 now. So if Dilip Kumar was there, we would have been little kids. But if he had asked me the question in 1970, I would have said no hope in hell. All the tigers will be extinct. The way things were going, when I was growing up in Puttur, tigers were hunted and paraded on the streets. 1965, 4 tigers were poisoned in Beltangadi. They were on the last legs, and I got on my bike desperate to see a tiger, went everywhere, never saw one till 1982. Started in 66. So it was a lost cause at that time. So something changed in between, which I want to mention before going to the future. In the 70s, we got a very strong prime minister who had a genuine interest in nature.
Closer, closer.
Can you hear me now?
That's okay. Why I am shouting a little bit, Ullas.
Sorry. So we got a prime minister who had a genuine interest in wildlife. The only one we had ever since independent to this day. But she also was a very capable, I would say, autocratic person who had complete political command over 11 of the big states. The chief minister did what she said. And the third thing was, she had come to power on a very populist agenda of opening the banks to the common people, socialism, Garibi Hatao. So she had the masses, she had the grip on the masses, and that is why she could introduce these two tremendous legislations. First was the Wildlife Protection Act in 1974, and the second one was the Forest Conservation Act in 1980. Two legislations that stood as the bulwark. Everybody is trying to dismantle them ever since then. But that's the reason why my fear that everything will go in 50 years didn't materialize. Tigers came back. There were about 70 at that time. Looking back through my scientific lens now, I would say there were 70 to 100 tigers in Malenad in Karnataka. There are probably 350 or so. All the government says there is 600 or 500 something. But still, coming back 5 times more tigers, 2 times more people, average wage up 10 times, common man's prosperity up multiple times, much more denser network of roads, much more development. I had never dreamt this would happen. Yeah, this is not. Sorry. Okay. So in a nutshell, so that happened in India. But in many of the other countries, at that point in time, after that, tigers in Asia-wide species. Iran lost its tigers, Bali and Indonesia lost its tigers, later Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, China has a little bit in one fringe. So we have done a good job compared to other countries. Maybe Nepal has done a good job, given our constraints, because we have so much money now. The country is now rich. I'm talking of a year when there were food riots in Karnataka. 1/3 the wheat from Kansas was brought to feed starving millions of India.
Ullas, you would like the scenario to develop a little bit in terms of the area available for tigers. You want to expand the area? Would you talk a little bit about that?
Thanks for reminding me about that. See, basically I was, because most conservationists, I find them boringly pessimistic. So I give my own example and say, look, I have seen this happen. So it's not that tigers are doomed. And in fact, tigers' extinction was predicted by Jim Corbett in 1931. He said they'll be gone by 1950, which nearly happened. But that, no, all these factors came in, what I described. In 1990s, when the Chinese bone trade came, Time Magazine, BBC, every conservationist friend of mine said the tiger will be gone in the year 2000. They are still ticking. But we need to do, just to wrap up, just to give the very big picture, there is 380,000 square kilometers of forest in India in which tigers can live, of which we have done a reasonable job of protecting only about 50 or 60,000 square kilometers. So there is scope in India for us to have 10 to 15,000 tigers, provided many major changes are required.
How many do we have now, according to the?
My guess is around 3,000, and they may have been 2,000. So no, 2 was when it started in 70s. But the scope is for 15. But we have lost that vision. There is no vision at the highest level, and then everybody else follows what the highest level. So it's really in the book, which I hope you will buy, which is in the store. I talk about this in great detail. What's the vision, but how do we get there? I don't have time to get into all of this now. Thank you.
We'd like to give a little time, 2 minutes, for some questions from the audience. If 1 or 2 questions.
With the land space available, and people and villagers and urbans encroaching onto the forest land, will there be enough land for them to grow to 1,500, as you said?
Yeah, sure. There is 380,000 square kilometers under direct control of the government, reserve forest. And if we can change land use outside, I'm talking of only that government land. If it is managed properly, we can have 10 to 15,000 tigers. The numbers they're talking about are not big. They're talking about saying we have 3,000. Best we can hope for is 3,500, which I think is a very...
Ullas says it's too modest and there's scope for more.
Frozen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ullas Karanth and Mr. James.
Thank you.